This is a special Father's Day episode of Sadler's Stories, and I'm going to tell you something about my dad, my adoptive father, Anton Sadler, a memory that I had having to do with a horror story and something very nice that he did for me as a kid. And this would have been towards the end of his life when I was either 10 or 11. We didn't know, of course, that his death was going to be happening not that long after that. And it had to do with him doing a task for me, something that I asked him to do, and which was, not the most onerous thing to do in the world, but involved some difficulty and some work on his part, which he was quite willing to do. And so I'll tell you the story, and it has to do with another story as well, because that's part of what he did for me. So, I don't remember whether I was 10 or 11, but I do remember, it must have been 11, because I was at University Lake School, and I remember that it was in the spring, and I'd gotten my hands on a book of horror stories. I had been reading horror stories since I was a kid. My great uncle Hubert, who I've talked about in another video, he was very big on us reading, and he would get me these Alfred Hitchcock anthologies every year, which were kind of for kids, but also really kind of not for kids, but they were for the kind of kid that I was. So, Monster Museum and Haunted Houseful and all those sorts of things. And they had classic horror stories in them. And I got my hands on this other one, and it had a story in it called Calamander Chest by Joseph Payne Brennan. And I think that it was actually his anthology called 9 Horrors and a Dream that was published in 1958 with Arkham House, which is based here in Wisconsin, founded by August Derleth. Big horror and sci-fi person associated with H.P. Lovecraft, but also with many other writers. We'll talk about that in just a moment. So I got my hands on this book, and it had a bunch of stories in it. I remember that. And I asked my dad, because I knew that he had access to a photocopy machine. And remember, we're talking at this point probably, it must have been, 1981, I'm guessing. And so we had photocopiers at that time, but it was kind of a rare thing. And photocopies were expensive. You paid a good bit for them. So he had a photocopier at work. He was working for Touche Ross here in Milwaukee, and he was a tax attorney. So he was kind of, well placed in the office, but he wasn't one of the partners. So, he would have been kind of in the pecking order, and it would have been kind of weird for him to be doing photocopies. And he told me, I'm going to have to photocopy these after work so people don't see me doing them. I'm not sure exactly what the story was, but I gathered that it was a task. But he was willing to do it. And I asked him, believe it or not, I asked him if he'd photocopy the whole book for me. And he said, I can only photocopy 4 stories. I don't know why it was 4, but there were 4. And so I kind of just picked them out here and there. And I don't remember what the other stories were. I only remember this one particular story, the Calamander Chest. So one night he came back from work, and he handed these photocopies to me, and he said, here you go. Here's your 4 stories. And I remember I would read at night past lights out. And the way that I would do it was not the way a lot of other kids would, like a flashlight or something. So I had a nightlight. And I don't know if my parents actually knew this or not. I didn't really need the nightlight. A nightlight, if you don't know what it is, it's a little tiny bulb, and you plug it into an outlet, and it's got usually a little thing around it so it's not casting direct light on you. And it's for kids who are scared of the dark. I actually wasn't scared of the dark, although after reading one of these stories, that was a little bit different. And what I would do is, they knew that I loved to read. I first learned how to read when I was about 3, and I just, read voraciously. And it was one of the things that I really took a lot of enjoyment in. So my parents, my bedtime was 9 o'clock on school nights, and I was supposed to have the lights out by that time. So what I would do is I'd leave the nightlight on, and then I would listen for them to go downstairs, and I would go over by the nightlight. And if it was cold, I'd have my blanket on me, and I'd read by the nightlight. I think I probably, didn't do my eyes any favor by engaging in that behavior. That might be why I have to wear glasses, although maybe some of it's just bad luck with my eyes. And so sometimes I would read for an hour or two. If I knew that if I had my actual light on, they would see that. But the nightlight, I was good. And if I heard them coming up the stairs, I would get under my covers and pretend to be asleep and, hide whatever I was reading somewhere. So I read that story by the nightlight, and that was quite a scary night. Because the story, the Calamander Chest. So Calamander, I guess, is a kind of wood. It's a short story, and it's pretty well constructed. There's a guy, and he buys a Calamander Chest. The previous owner, nobody knows what became of them until later on in the story. The chest is being sold really cheap, and I guess, it's kind of a nice piece of furniture. So he buys it, and he polishes it up, and he's got it in his bedroom. And then the first night that he's awake, the chest opens up. Already we're getting kind of horror stuff, right? Oh, what's happening here? And it gets worse. A single finger comes out, and the finger is that of a corpse, a dead person, and it beckons to the guy. And he finds himself sort of hypnotically drawn by this, and he gets up out of bed and starts walking over to the chest. And the way that the author described it, there's a sense that things are really wrong, that if he reaches this chest, something bad is going to happen to him, but he can't stop himself from walking to it. And then he wakes up, and it's the morning, and he thinks, oh, that must have been a bad dream, things don't happen like that in real life. And of course he doesn't do anything. And then the next night, the finger comes out and beckons him again, and he's closer to it when he gets away, if I'm remembering the story right. Then I got to lock this chest up. Now he's actually feeling like something is wrong, and he arranges for it to be taken away by workmen. But they say, oh, we can't do it today. We'll come by tomorrow and get the chest for you. Landlord will let us in, and we'll take care of it. So he goes to bed, and now he's got the chest locked. And there's a key in the lock, so it's not going to be a big deal, right? And then he hears this sound of the key sliding, and it falls on the floor. And now, coming out of the keyhole is the finger, and it's gesturing to him, come here. And he gets up, and he goes over to the chest, and either the chest is unlocked or he unlocks it himself, and he gets into the chest. And that's the last that we hear of him. And then there's sort of like a flash forward with the workmen complaining about how heavy the chest is as they're taking it out. And he's dead and gone. And then that's what happened apparently to the previous owner, who is found dead in the chest. So a really good horror story by this Joseph Payne Brennan. I found it great literature and also terrifying at the same time. That, the way he described the finger. So flash forward, I've read the story, now I'm going to bed, and of course I'm now kind of scared, and my imagination is going wild. I get through the night, I don't have any bad dreams about the finger, but it's still kind of lingering with me. And my dad, understandably enough, asks me, so how did you like the stories? Are they any good? And I didn't want to tell him that I had scared myself. with reading this story and my own imagination coming from it. So I don't remember exactly what I told him, but it was some sort of cover story, like, oh, they were good, but, not that scary. And the irony is, so a little bit of digression here, my dad also had a knack for horror. When I was much younger, like elementary school age, probably, first or second grade, as our neighborhood was beginning to fill up with other families and kids, so it must have actually been like third or fourth grade, we had this wonderful fieldstone fireplace in our house, in the living room. And the house was one that my dad had, bought the land for and worked with an architect, he and my mom, to design the house the way that they wanted. It was a 2-story that had like a living room, which was kind of fancy, with the books and the nice furniture, and then a family room, as you call it, where it was much more rough and tumble. And there was this, like I said, great fieldstone fireplace that had a big wide mouth, and we used to not just, have fires in there, but like roast marshmallows and sometimes, cook things on the fire. And it was really nice to do. And we'd have like, wood piled up alongside the garage that he taught me how to split it, and I would do that. Anyway, we'd have fires quite often. And, have hot chocolate and snacks and things like that. So during the fires, he would tell stories. And the stories that he would tell were pretty scary stories. They weren't that scary for me, although I think my sister got a bit scared. But they terrified the neighborhood kids so much on the few occasions that they came over to for story time and a fire, that they went home and had bad dreams and nightmares and didn't, want to go to sleep. And their parents actually called my dad and complained that he needed to tone the stories down. I remember him telling stories about werewolves and all sorts of things like that. And he, he would tell the stories. They weren't just short campfire yarns. They would go on and on and on. There were quite a lot of elements to them, so to speak, and maybe that's what made them so vivid for these poor kids. And these were kids that I thought were, sometimes tougher than me, but when it came to my dad's stories, they were all wimps. And so anyway, long story short, for some reason I didn't want to tell my dad about the scary finger and how much it had gotten to me. And I never did tell him. I don't think I ever brought that up. And I remember later on, so this is shifting topic a little bit, this is after he died. I still had those 4 photocopied stories around. And I remember thinking to myself, what an effort he had gone to do this thing for me that I was asking him to do, that he wasn't supposed to be doing, but he was willing to do anyway for me because I was his kid and it was, something he wanted to do. You could say, well, is it a good father who's breaking the rules for their kid? And I would say, well, in the case of my dad, yeah. He was also somebody who was an incredibly hard worker. I'm sure that he was a major asset to his firm because, not too long after that, they sent him down to Houston to open up the new office for Touche Ross, which was expanding all over the place at that time. So they clearly had some confidence in his abilities. And he was a very smart guy and a very, very astute person, the way he engaged with other people. So that was something that we shared in common, was this interest in horror. Actually, I'll tell you one other thing about horror and sci-fi that has to do with him that kind of consolidates this. So, as I mentioned, my bedtime was 9 o'clock when I was that age. But there was one exception. On Saturday nights, we could watch, he and I, Shock Theater. And Shock Theater was this show. It's sort of like what they had in Chicago with Son of Svengoolie, which was based there in Chicago. We had something like that up here in Milwaukee on the independent channel 18. And what it was is a guy who would wear corpse makeup, essentially, what they nowadays associate with like death metal and stuff like that. But at this time, it was more like a Halloween sort of thing. And he would introduce a movie, either a horror movie or a fantasy movie or a sci-fi movie, and they were usually pretty schlocky. You know, like we saw Soylent Green, and we saw a bunch of like sci-fi things with, you know, people zapping each other. We saw some older movies that had like the, you know, not animatronic, but, you know, whatever it was that they were doing with the stop motion photography with the monsters and animals and things, you know, dinosaurs and things like that. So we would watch these movies, and that meant I got to stay up with him until about midnight, or sometimes even after that. We'd make some popcorn and we'd hang out and watch this movie. I remember one was called Green Slime, and it was on like a space station or something, and Green Slime, it had this terrible song that went with it, you know, Green Slime. Did you hear what the captain said? Green slime, you'll believe it when you're dead. You know? And it was that sort of thing. And then not Svengoolie, but the Shock Theater guy, I forget his name, he would burst in and say some crazy stuff before it would go to commercial, right? And then it would go to commercial, and then the movie would come back, and he'd make fun of the movie. It was sort of like, in a way, Mystery Science, what is it, 3000 or whatever it is, long before that existed. And so there were different shows like that, and we would watch those, and you know, we'd talk about that when we'd go fishing, and so he was a cool dad when it came to horror and science fiction, and that story was really something. You know, thinking back to it again, this guy who, you know, if he were brought back to life today, he would be much younger than I am now. I'm just thinking about him, this guy who was such a hard worker and had so many responsibilities, and yet he found the time to make photocopies for his, you know, crazy request from his kid who is interested in this Joseph Payne Brennan story. And yeah, he was a cool guy. So I'll just end it there. I think that's probably enough said about this. Maybe some of you have similar stories, or, you know, tangents that are connected to this in some way. I will point out too that I do think it was 9 Horrors in a Dream from Arkham House, and that would be kind of a cool thing if it is true, because Arkham House, August Derleth based it here in Wisconsin, in Sauk City. That was a major press for fantasy, horror, science fiction. He's the one who, you know, put H.P. Lovecraft stuff back on the map. And so apparently Brennan worked with Derleth and became friends with him. And so that's why it was at Arkham House. It would make sense that the copies of it would be in libraries around here because, you know, distribution in the Wisconsin area. So, yeah, that's a good place to leave off with that little footnote. And I hope you enjoyed the story.